yourself to ask or write your question in the chat box. I, along with the other moderators, will be monitoring the chat and will ask on your behalf. If you have a question that you'd like to ask anonymously, please send the chat just to me and I'll ask it without using your name. The content and discussion in this presentation will necessarily engage with issues of human trafficking, which can include sexual and physical abuse. Some of the content will be emotionally, intellectually challenging to engage with. I, along with the other moderators, the presenters, and all others who are speaking, will do our best to make this virtual meeting a space where we can engage bravely, empathetically, thoughtfully with difficult content throughout this symposium. With the virtual format of this year's symposium, we have participants joining from all over the US and internationally. As an icebreaker, we'd love to know where you all are joining us from. If you'd like, please enter where you're joining from in the chat. So now I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Julie Russo, and she's a current Master's of Public Health Canada at VCU, where she serves as president of the Public Health Student Association. She draws from experience working on intersecting research areas such as adverse childhood experiences, the trauma of the prison pipeline, and human trafficking awareness. Through her program, she has been developing a support group manual geared towards friends and family of human trafficking survivors. Our next speaker is Emma Marie, who received a degree in psychology with a cognitive and crisis counseling. She's a current day program coordinator for a mental health agency in Virginia and is working towards a graduate degree in clinical counseling. She is a mother of a human trafficking survivor and remains dedicated to supporting human trafficking survivors and their families. Julie and Emma will also be joined by Celie. Celie Dean is the grandmother of a human trafficking survivor. She now advocates to support caregivers of survivors and to help prevent youth from being exploited. Together, they'll discuss a 6-week support group to address an unfilled need in our community. We are so grateful to have you all here with us, and I'll now turn it over to you all.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben, for the very kind introduction. I was telling people I've never been introduced before, so that was very nice. As he said, my name is Julie Russo. I'm a second-year Master of Public Health student. And just before we get started, I wanted to go over some objectives that we have for you guys with this presentation today. I only have about 6 slides here because I really did not want to spew a bunch of information without having some thoughtful discussion and dialogue. So these 6 slides are really just going to be going over this topic from a public health angle. So when we talk about this topic in public health, there we go. When we talk about this topic in public health, one of the first places that it's important to start is understanding where are the gaps in the research that we're looking at. So most interventions that we see for co-survivorship, in co-survivorship meaning outside of just human trafficking, but in general with different events, a lot of this revolves around raising education and awareness to what human trafficking is and potentially some prevention mechanisms for usually geared towards adolescents and families. We don't see as much on the emotional support side for people who have already experienced these traumatic events. So now that we understand where the gap is, why is this important to be looking at? Why is this something that we're researching? I'm sure many of you are aware that healthy interpersonal relationships really pose a lot of benefits for people throughout their lives. Some of those being that they're protective factors for different forms of abuse, trauma, adverse childhood experiences. And we can help people move towards these healthy interpersonal relationships by providing safer spaces to evaluate these trafficking experiences that they've been through and finding a supportive community that can share their experience. And keeping in mind that as we go through this, trauma-informed care strategies are really important. And when I talk about trauma-informed care, what I mean is that we're not reducing people down to a single traumatic event, but rather people are whole individuals that have a lot of unique traits and unique personalities that should really be celebrated and accounted for. And when we understand that trauma can really affect every facet of our lives, we can a lot more appropriately respond through policies, procedures, research, and even just how we interact with our peers. So moving on to assessing need, this is another important part of the development, and nothing formalized has been done by my team and I thus far, but we have been conducting interviews for the past few months with who I've listed off right here: Department of Justice, healthcare providers like many of yourselves, survivors, co-survivors, and educators, with the main goal of this to really be determining what type of support people are looking for, where are the gaps that they see that we can help fill in those resources. And this leads us into talking about something called community engaged research, which if you look at the second bullet, that's really what we're talking about here, is conducting research with the community. That when you set these tables to have these conversations, you have to include the voices that are going to be affected. And that means every stage of the research process, whether it's developing programs or implementing them in communities. And so to get people talking a little bit, I thought it'd be a good idea with this last bullet, a strength versus deficit based approach. This is a really awesome tool. And I wanted to hear from people if you know what that is, if you want to tell us what that means to you or how you've used it in your work. And if you feel more comfortable in the chat box, that's fine too. But I'd love to hear from somebody.
My understanding of this, Julie, is like kind of from the motivational interviewing side of things, where you assess where somebody's at, just, I guess, not just in terms of wanting to make a change in their life, but just on the spectrum of how they feel they are about a certain aspect of their life. Like, for example, childcare. So asking them, how they feel like they're doing as a parent, being able to identify things that they feel like they're doing well, and then also asking them where are areas that you think you could improve on, instead of assessing it from like you had a CPS case, so that means you're a bad mom.
Nail on the head, Carrie. That was a wonderful description. Actually, what I was kind of thinking of too, of, looking at people and understanding what's working, what's going well, and really finding those strengths within our own communities to, not focus so heavily on what is being lacked that needs to be added in, but where are the strengths that we can find and work with. If anybody else has any examples, feel free to keep adding them in the chat as we continue. So the next stage is the development of the non-clinical support group. The emphasis here being on non-clinical. The key factor when we were looking through this at the very beginning is understanding that while both are beneficial, there are a lot of differences between therapy and support groups. But to be completely candid, there's a lot of overlap as well. And sometimes that line can be very blurry in the developmental stages. But the one thing that we kept looking at was they have different overall goals. The main goal of a support group being to help people cope with events that have happened in the past. And support groups also have the ability to be peer-led. So, right, like we talked about with the strength versus deficit-based approach, we're capitalizing on the strengths that are in co-survivors and in that community. And then the last two bullets, these are just also some other benefits of a support group. The fact that people can empathize with similar experience and also be connected with resources that are in their own communities. But now, since there's such a transition to different things online, even connecting with resources that may be completely across the country. And finally, I have two last slides before we start some discussion. These are theoretical frameworks, and the disclaimer here is that theory is very interesting and it can be a useful tool, but it's not meant to be something that is a strict set of guidelines to adhere to. Excuse me. It's rather supposed to be a guiding factor to help develop some infrastructure. So the one that I have here today is the stages of change, which some people may know as the trans-theoretical model. It was developed around the late 70s, and it really found its beginnings in talking about smoking cessation. So like all models and frameworks, everything operates under these certain assumptions. And one of the assumptions for this framework being behavior change is never something that's going to happen decisively and quickly. It is more so a nonlinear process that really needs to account for individual need. And when I say account for individual need, I'm talking about the fact that people can start in different places of this stage, people can move through at different times, and it's also okay to move backwards and go from one stage to another. Like I said, it's accounting for meeting people where they're at and going from there. And so this right here, in my experience, like with working with these theories in class, this has been a much more parsimonious explanation that I like a little bit better. So I'll give you guys some time to look through the right side of it that may put things in a little bit clearer of a perspective. And if anybody has questions about this and would like me to elaborate more, please feel free. And just some references if people would like to look up more information after. And I can keep this slide up if people have questions, but I don't know if I can see chat while I'm, oh yes, I think I can. There we go, okay. You guys, anybody have any slides you'd like me to go back to or touch on anything a little bit more? I know that was very fast, but I feel like the most beneficial part of this will be hearing from Emma and Celie. Yes. Wow, it worked, okay.
Julie, there's a question in the chat about if the social aspect of a support group can help participants advance through the stages of change.
Great question, Stacy. Yes, absolutely. There's different things that are outlined in research about what helps people move through these stages. And one of those being the social context. And, you know, that's how you develop self-efficacy and support, which can in turn help you move from a stage of, I'm not, excuse me, I'm not ready to do this to, okay, I can find these resources, I can find this confidence, and then go through that. And then I see Robert has a question as well. Robert, thank you for that question, because that is something, once COVID started, we added that question into our interviews with our community partners because we wanted to see, you know, would this be something that's more beneficial online? But like anything, if it's online, there has to be some form of almost like a screening process, and you do have to be a little bit more careful with privacy concerns just being on the internet. COVID definitely has impacted accessibility. Sometimes, like I said, it can even make it easier because you don't have to be in a physical location of where your support group is. Like you could be completely out of state. Yes, I'll go back to, would it be more helpful for me to stay on this slide or go back to the previous? Okay. Okay, so there's no one structured, oh, did we get another chat? Okay. There is no one structured definition of what this theory really is. Again, it's something that's supposed to be more of a guiding factor that you can almost use to your interpretation in certain spots. But to give the best definition I could of this, like I said, stages of change, it's 5 different stages that is assumed people will be moving through in order to make a behavior change. So to give some more context, when we start up here, I'm sorry that it's blurry. If we start up here at pre-contemplation, this is usually a stage that somebody's at where they're either unwilling to be making a change or they're unaware that there could be a problem that's going on somewhere. And usually to move from one stage to another, there's different things that can help. So like I said, in pre-contemplation, if somebody's unaware of a behavior that could be negatively affecting them, moving from pre-contemplation to contemplation could just be educating and saying, hey, this is something that may be negatively affecting, you know, your interpersonal relationships or things that are going on in your life. And then, like I said, again, there's different ways to move from different stages. And some later models have something called termination, which we don't use as much, but that's also something to think about if you research this a little bit on your own. Did that answer your question, or is there something more specific I can answer for you about that? Yes. So an example for this, the one that if you see like in a classroom setting, The example, oh, and I'm sorry, I'll go back to your question after, Celeste. An example of this that we see a lot in a classroom setting would be exercise. So let's take, for example, walking 30 minutes a day. And I'll just set myself in a stage. So if I'm in the stage of contemplation and I'm going to be moving through, in contemplation, deciding to walk for 30 minutes a day, it's on my radar and I'm thinking about it and I'm trying to seek out some information about, okay, what's a way I could do this? How can I fit that into my routine? And moving from contemplation to preparation, it could be just raising my self-efficacy and my confidence that, okay, I can get outside for 30 minutes a day. Here's where I put it into my schedule. Here's how I'm going to plan to do this. So instead of just thinking about it and knowing the benefits of it, it's like fitting it into your routine and knowing how to plan for it. And then Celeste asked, what is the protocol for mandated reporting when someone in a support group or in therapy discloses their child is/has been a victim of human sex trafficking? So for this, that's where the line of therapy versus support group kind of gets a little bit blurry. We have talked about before, there's really no mandated reporting that I know of thus far with support groups, because it would be non-clinical, like I said before, peer-led, so that there really, I don't think would be any mandated reporting. But we have talked about before, if we do a support group, having somebody with us in the room that's a licensed professional that would more so know the ethics and the rules behind that. Victor, can you give an example in the context of human trafficking that you have seen through your discussion with co-survivors, professionals, and educators?
Hey, Julie, I think Courtney wanted to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just had a question on, I really liked your example of the no, maybe, using those to describe the stages. I was just wondering if you could comment on if you had any experience of whether or not it's helpful to talk to a patient, for example, about the stages. I'm in med school and I just always am hesitant of like, do you find that it's helpful or people are more receptive to knowing that there are stages? I could see how it'd be helpful in someone that like went backwards versus some people would be more frustrated, like, don't tell me that I need to think about quitting smoking.
Right. So I think that can kind of be interwoven sometimes. If I would be discussing a framework with somebody, I would not be using the words, look, you're in pre-contemplation now and we're going to move you to, no, that I'm not doing that. It's more so of just having open discussions with people and being able to say, like, if somebody's stuck somewhere, saying, hey, behavior change, like making changes even outside of theory and public health, like it's not just a one-day thing that you just decide to do and then go on with, like it moves through stages. So really just having those, being as candid as possible with, not really verbatim saying, okay, we're in this stage right now, but more so putting it in terms of, everyday life, that it is just sometimes how life works, how behavior change happens. Does that make some more sense of how to structure a conversation around that?
Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Victor asked to give an example in the context of human trafficking that you've seen through your discussions with co-survivors. Sure. So one of the discussions that I've had with somebody, there was an individual who was explaining their response to maybe a trigger, which could be seeing something on the news. So one of the things to think about there is, okay, well, how do we cope with that? What is a skill set that we can develop to be able to identify that trigger and know, okay, like I need to walk away from this, like from the television set. And I would say that there's different tools that you can use in different stages to help move, like mindfulness, like understanding that sometimes negative emotions are simply that. They're things that come up in our minds sometimes and they pass through an open door as we sit and we watch them. We are not our emotions. They're something we experience. So I would say an example to put that into stages would be moving from preparation to action, right? So if we're in preparation, we have a plan. Okay, if I'm sitting down watching the television and I see something come up on the news channel that's related to human trafficking, what can I do in that moment? Because I know now that that is going to trigger me and bring up some negative emotions. So what can I do to put that into action? Even if that's just walking away from the TV and turning it off, that is moving from, okay, I have a plan. Now I'm doing this plan and here it is. Does that help, Victor? Oh, excuse me. That was a private question. I'm sorry. Any last couple questions about this before we hear from Emma and Celie?
Hey, Julie, it's Stacy.
Hey, Stacy.
So in the example you were just giving us with human trafficking on the news, so to clarify, if someone is identifying that they have these triggers that would create a negative emotional response, would that be like contemplation? Just identifying that there is something that exists that creates this bad environment for them?
I think that could definitely be part of it. This is where sometimes that not so rigid structure comes in, because I do believe that, you could even talk about that in terms of pre-contemplation of just this awareness of, okay, this is a problem and what are we going to do about it? But in pre-contemplation, somebody may not be ready yet to make that change. And even though we're talking about something as what seems as simple as turning off the TV or walking away, it's not as easy sometimes as I think these theories make it seem by just moving through these very nice couple stages in a circle. But I do think that it could be contemplation as well. I was just giving that example just of moving from, having a plan for yourself to moving into action to actually doing it.
Right. Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and, could even come into play in maintenance? Yes, most definitely. In maintenance, this is a really cool part to add really quick, that maintenance, another way that I like to look at that is sustainability. So when you're developing a support group that could be peer-led, you're also accounting for the fact that this is something that can continue on for a few years. As more people gain that strength and those who are emotionally willing and ready can come in and lead that group themselves. That is a sustainability aspect. And thank you everybody for listening to these few slides, and I'm here to answer any questions at the end as well. Please keep the questions coming if you have them. These are great.
Julie, did you have an introduction for Emma, Celie, or did you all want to just go ahead and start talking?
For sure. Emma, if you wanted to go ahead, Emma and Celie have so graciously offered to share their experiences with us, actually having this lived experience with this topic. So Emma and Celie, if you have anything you would like to share or just that you think would be helpful for the group, the floor is yours. Feel free.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I specifically work on is reunification of families and bringing families back together, because unfortunately, as you can imagine, there's a tremendous amount of trauma that happens to victims of sex trafficking, regardless of their age. So if they're a child or they're an adult, and each family member of that person or close friend is also affected. So the trauma doesn't just start and end with the actual, the victim itself of this crime. Unfortunately, secondary trauma that occurs to family members as well. And that's something that isn't really focused a lot on. And so when you have several members, each person obviously has their own journey that they go through in the healing process. But then when a victim comes home, the family has the secondary trauma from what has occurred to their child, but also has a secondary trauma of what they have to witness their child living through after they come home. And that's something that's really not talked about. Many times victims of these crimes will self-harm themselves, self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, things like that. And if there's a legal trial that they go through, judges, as well as Commonwealth attorneys, things like that, will actually look at the victim as if they're no longer a victim because they are self-harming or they are doing drugs or maybe even having sex with other individuals, kind of resorting, I don't want to say back to that area, but again, maybe for a financial profit, not because they want to, but because they are hurting inside. And there's not enough that is known or shared in that area. And unfortunately, a judge or a lawyer will look at that as, clearly this person is not telling the truth, things like that, when in fact they're just hurting inside and expressing that pain. And so that can be used against them. And so I'm really focusing on trying to bring more awareness to the pain and suffering of family members who love the individuals that have been in sex trafficking, and being able to show that it is possible with a lot of love and support to get victims of these crimes in a wonderful place, but also to bring them back to their family and have the family in a wonderful place. And that's not to say that it's not a continuous effort, because it would be a fantasy to believe that in fact you weren't working on it day to day. But the reality is that at the end of the day, with lots of love and support, something that's not really out there for families, that everyone can kind of come together and have a healthy place for the victim of the crime as well as their family. I know also prevention programs. There's a lot of programs that focus on younger children, but we don't really think about how sometimes victims of these crimes get involved in sex trafficking. Several years ago, I know it hit the news that there was Craigslist, and some of the individuals were actually hunting, so to speak, through scholarship type programs, things like that, trying to advertise great ways to make money, but they wouldn't necessarily tell the young ladies or young men how they would be making money for these scholarships until, unfortunately, these individuals were in too deep, right? They just couldn't get out of the situation at that point. So I think better prevention programs need to be out there on the high school level, but we also need to focus on the younger levels. There's some effort in some states to look at just high school, but then there's middle schoolers and there is elementary children, obviously, that get involved in human trafficking. And so it's really important to start on, a lower level at that point, introducing them to what it is for trafficking, but on an age appropriate level. And, what's friendly, what's bad touching and good touching and those type of things, and progress from there as a starting point. Unfortunately, sex trafficking is, something that in America is an epidemic issue, but a lot of people have been ignoring it for a really long time. And it's not until your family is obviously impacted that you realize just how, big this problem truly is.
Yeah,
Cecilia, do you have anything to say? I'm sorry.
Celie, do you have anything to say? Celie, you're on mute.
Yeah, let me unmute.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
I think that Emma really did encapsulate a lot of all of it to not only help the survivor of the trafficking, but to help the family become whole and be healed as as this brokenness that happens in the relationships does not get healed overnight, just like the trafficker or the person who's been trafficked doesn't get healed overnight. My family I'm the grandmother of the child that was trafficked, and in another state. And so there was a distance there initially of trying to understand what had happened, how it had happened, the impact on her family, her immediate family. And so it was, well, to put it simply, it's just been a big, huge mess in trying to, you have the part of the family that doesn't want to talk about it. You know, we'd like to just go and move on and pretend this didn't happen. Fortunately, my granddaughter did not have to be pulled into court to testify against. They had used her testimony when she met with the FBI. So I'm very grateful for that, not having to relive it. But I think also, like Emma said, sometimes behaviors that happen after the trafficking are often viewed upon as, oh, well, she brought this on herself because she doesn't know how to live a right life or do the right thing or whatever. And so it kind of snowballs. My involvement in this became more direct after she was trafficked. Her mom felt, and I agreed, that she needed to be away from the area until they could figure out what to do or what this was going to look like. So she came here in Virginia to live with us for several weeks. And I was at a loss, which goes back to Julie and all of the wonderful things that she's doing and trying to find a way to help people, to fill a void. As Emma said, trafficking is rampant. I didn't know that you could have actually other teenagers befriend you in high school in order to coerce you into coming into trafficking. You know, she was in a new school, friend reached out, she liked having a new friend, and this girl was already involved. And I don't lay, I lay that completely on the trafficker, but that's how these girls' minds are manipulated and, you know, reached out to in ways that you would think are very innocent, and it's not. So anyway, she was here with us. I didn't know how to help in any stage of this. I mean, I knew that it was going to have to be something long-term. I was pointed to Impact Virginia, where I met Faye, and she was a great help to us. But also true to form, if you don't get the right kind of support for these young girls, and she was barely 16 when it happened, there are other things that take place that kind of snowballed in her life, and she became pregnant not long after. And so now she has a little young child that she's trying to figure out how to be a mom and how to take care of a baby. And she's moved away from her parents and is living with someone. So there are these after effects that, as one of you said, it does need to be a long-term, years-long way to help her get from the mindset of I'm really not worth much to my best years are ahead of me, because they very definitely take on this feelings of just not being worth much. And if you have family members that don't know how to come against that thought process because they're dealing with their own sense of pain, then you have a ripple effect all across. So I'm very glad to see these efforts being made, because as I'll restate that it is such a widespread problem.
Yeah. Julie, this is Faye. Could I just say a couple of things?
Sure, of course.
Hi, everybody. This is Faye. I have to thank Julie, Emma, and Celie. This whole idea came about after I met my third family member. Actually, the first one, she was a friend of a victim, and then I met Celie, and then I met Emma. And these women were just at a loss, like, who is there for me? Who can support me? And I just realized, oh my gosh, all the services, all the resources are going to the victims. What's happening to the families? They're suffering. The vicarious trauma is through the roof in the family members, caregivers who are taking care of the victims. And so, I got to know Julie. She was the first year in her MPH studies, and she came up to me and said, Faye, I want to help. And so I said, Julie, well, I have a project for you. And so I told her, I said, I think there's just this gap. There's a need for a support group, because I called everywhere in Virginia, all organizations, to see if they offered support groups for the caregivers of victims. And there were nothing. And so I said, Julie, let's just do this. And so Julie was very kind enough to take it as her project. And Emma and Celie giving us advice, how to develop the program, talking to survivors. And then shortly thereafter, it was maybe 2 or 3 months ago, I got a call from an advocate in North Carolina. And she was explaining something to me that sounded just like someone like Celie, what you were telling me at the time when I met you. And she says, I really need support. I can't find any support in North Carolina. Is there any support in Virginia? And I said, no, that's why we're developing this support group. And she was just so thrilled. And she wanted to talk to her supervisor about replicating the program that we're doing up here. So there's obviously a need. I was put in touch with some folks in South Carolina who take care of the foster care program, and they thought it was a great idea to form a support group for the foster parents who are caring for the victims. So they're interested in our model. So I just want to say thank you, Julie. Thank you, Celie. How I met Celie was through a friend of mine who works at Staples, Marcia, who is a friend of Celie's. And it's just been a wonderful journey with you, Celie, and with you, Emma, and to be able to be there to support you and to listen to the struggles of being a parent or a grandparent of a survivor of human trafficking. It's a horrendous task, and I'm really sorry that you guys are feeling alone with no where to turn to. And hopefully that what we're doing together will fill a gap in the community.
Thank you. I know personally, though, going through this and not being able to find support only made me fight harder, though, personally, to find other families, because I knew I couldn't, you couldn't be by yourself, right? So and when you talk to the medical community, or you talk to the police departments, they weren't really a great support system that way. Even when you talk to therapists, not many were trained specifically in working with victims of sex trafficking. And I know it's probably hard to understand, but many times they would go, well, that's the same as a sexual assault. Well, it's not the same. Now, maybe those things happened, but there's other layers of trauma that have occurred in that. And then, like I said, if you add family members to that, the victim themselves harbor shame. And the community tend to shame victims because of just the title alone. So they harbor shame for, towards their family because they know their family is suffering. Then they have shame for what they have been involved in, even though obviously not always by choice. Initially, some might, say yes and then quickly change. There are those moments that can occur. But, it's unfortunate that there's just not more awareness out there for, these type of situations. And I know that's one of the things I've been fighting for so much, is just to bring awareness that, not every victim of a sex trafficking crime comes from a horrible family. It's a popular misconception. Sometimes, believe it or not, there are ordinary families that have victims of these crimes. And when they come home, there's thousands and thousands of dollars of medical treatment that families have to come forward and do. And I say have to because they want to take care of their child. But then when you add other people into that, it's not just their child, it becomes mom, dad, brothers, sisters, things like that, who need medical care, emotional medical care. And sometimes those traumas for siblings does not show up in the first 6 months, the first year. Sometimes it's 2 years down the road when, Bob all of a sudden stops turning in all his schoolwork. Because the trial part may be over, or maybe the criminal is now getting out of jail 4 years later and they don't understand why their sibling has had to go through this, and the person is now out. So those kind of layers of trauma can occur years down the road for siblings that sometimes can go unnoticed by many people. And it's hard because society also thinks that you have your child home, you should be grateful. Why are you suffering? Why is your family suffering still? And it's because they can't for a second comprehend the magnitude of the trauma that has occurred on a secondary level, which is very much similar to the primary victim themselves. And so that unfortunately gets often ignored. And so then you feel, as a family, you only have your family unit as a support system at that point, because you feel like you can't turn to anyone else for help because they can't understand. And yet you're happy that they can't understand, because to understand, they would have had to live through it. And so what's been nice about connecting with this group is the fact that you feel like you're not alone anymore. You feel like you have a support system, even if you maybe haven't met everyone in that support system. And so that's why prevention programs are so important, because through a prevention program, you can also say, if this happens to your family, this is where you can turn, which is really, really important.
Let me just hop in for a second and agree with Emma again on all of that. I think after my granddaughter left from our care right after the trafficking, went back to North Carolina with her parents, became pregnant, came back to live with us through the pregnancy. During the time when she wasn't here, I couldn't figure out what was going on in me. I couldn't figure out why I've seemed to be having panic attacks, which I don't have. I couldn't figure out why I'd wake up in the middle of the night and couldn't go back to sleep, because that's not part of my norm. So I went into counseling, found a trauma counselor, didn't deal with anything related to trafficking, but what she diagnosed me with was secondary PTSD. And I was stunned. And I thought, well, if this is happening 2 generations out, what is happening to her mom? Is she just shutting down places? And then there were younger children in the home. As you said, Emma, what is that going to look like in 3 or 4 years, maybe, even though she's not there anymore? So all of these things, I think you do have to go down a what if list in order to put things into place that will help survivors and those in the survivors' families. So just a great commending to all of you who are listening, but all of you who are involved in developing ways and means to get people to be back in healthy relationships, because the victims especially no longer, they don't have a benchmark for what's healthy anymore. They think well, if I'm not doing that, but I'm doing other things, then that's better than doing that. Then I'm not involved in that anymore, as though they woke up one morning and decided to do that, you know. So they feel much shame. They feel like, well, if I hadn't gone with my friend, that wouldn't have happened. I mean, there's all this, they don't even look at the person that used them. They're glad they're in jail, maybe, if that happens. But there's so much that needs to be, so many levels that need to be educated in this. The legal systems, the law enforcement systems. I mean, you know, if a girl is taken away from a trafficking situation, they still take her to jail because they don't have anywhere else to put these children, which immediately they're labeled as the ones that did something wrong. So there's a lot of work to be done, but this is definitely a start for sure.
Well, and the other thing, sorry, the other thing too is, you know, when, I mean, the hard side to talk about is when a victim comes home and they're with their family and they start acting out, or maybe they obviously are not acting like they did the day before or the last time that the family member saw them. You know, sometimes you don't like the person who came home, right? Like that's the hard truth. And people don't want to say that because they are a victim of a crime. But the reality is the person who left your house or left and came back is a whole new person by no fault of their own. And yet you have to learn to re-love this person. And that's a process in itself, because as a family, you have to grieve the loss of the life you had before this event happened. You can't obviously go back and change any of it. So you have to grieve as if it was a death to your family, and you have to move forward. But you also have to grieve, and I know this sounds really morbid and it may trigger some people, but you do have to grieve as if your child died and you have this new person that you have to learn to understand. You have to learn to love in a different way, right? I mean, it's not the same person, especially when they're lashing out because you're helping. And so it's a whole process, and not a lot of people want to admit that. But the reality is that's what you have to go through. And the blessing of doing that, fighting to the end, is you have a better relationship, you know, but you have to do that process. And that's a long, hard process. And I know not a lot of people want to do that process because, you know, that the child that comes back to you, you know, they're hurting, they're lashing, they're doing things that maybe you would never have thought for a second they would have done previously. And now all of a sudden it's this new person. And there's just so much pain that comes from that. And that's something that the world really doesn't see. It's like, here's this crime that happens, and then this person comes home and yay, let's all, you know, have a big party and be happy and move on and life is good, right? No, that's not the way it works at all. There's so many layers of pain and hurt that have to be worked through, that years and years and years of really good therapy still only scrape the top layer off. And so, you know, when these victims, I know there's a lot of people in the medical field on here. I myself have gone into mental health counseling specifically because of circumstances like this, because, you know, for me, it was really important for families to understand that it's okay to say, I don't like you. It's okay to say, I don't understand why this happened. It's okay to say goodbye to the life you don't have. And at the end of the day, it's okay to know that your ordinary family is amazing because you fought really, really hard to get where you are. And then when your child goes and they make something awesome with the rest of their life, you know that it was because of the support system in that foundation and the wonderful heart your child still had somewhere hidden inside there. And I say hidden inside because there's lots of yucky layers, you know, that have to get to getting back to that point. And so, you know, when someone comes to you, say in a hospital setting or in an emergency room or maybe in your clinical office and things like that, please remember that it's not just the primary victim that needs care. If you have an emergency room visit and you have, any type of sexual assault victim that comes before you, they have a family, they have brothers, they have sisters. Hopefully they're able to be there with them at that moment. But, when they go home, it's not just them. They have people that love them and need just as much care as the primary victim. And so it's important that although you send them home with information, or maybe you're treating them in a clinical setting for care, it's important to remember that this is a package deal. If their family is still there with them or not, they still have that connection to their family. And ultimately, if possible, every effort should be made to continue to work and develop that relationship as much as possible. Victims of crimes are going to be able to progress at a faster rate and heal faster if they have a support system from their family. But we're not perfect, right? We have our downfalls and struggle and hurt and sometimes want to crawl in a hole and die just as much of the victim themselves. And it's not abnormal for family members to want to kill themselves from living through these same situations, even from secondary trauma. And so it's really important to remember the psychological component for each victim of this crime, because it's not just a primary victim issue. It spirals in kind of like a spider web, if that makes sense.
A question, if I can ask. My name is Marie Norman, and I live in Jacksonville, Florida, but I work for an agency that serves victims and survivors of human trafficking. So I am directly working in the work right now. And so one of the things that I noticed, and I'm so glad that you guys are doing this, is that our parents or the families need just as much support as our survivors do as well. And so I was working with my team to try to come up with a support group for the families that we work with. So this is awesome. I'm glad to be here. But one of the things that I have noticed in my work as well is that sometimes some of the families that we're working with have a lot of, it's generational trauma. So there's already trauma that's going on, unresolved trauma that's going on with the parent and or caregiver. And then you see it go into the next generation, and it's just doubly impacted, I guess. And then the other thing, and even just before I hopped on this Zoom, I was working with an adoptive mother who is she is terribly in need of support. Her daughter was just recovered yesterday. And so I've been trying to offer support, but she is she's very angry. And I mean, she is all of the feelings right now. So adoptive mom is just going through a lot of different emotions and feeling as though, all of the time and the effort that she has sown into her daughter is really, has just been a waste. And so she's just even considering having the adoption overturned. And I'm just trying to work to get her to a space to where she can understand, because she even said, Emma and Celie, what you all had said, that this is the young lady that I picked up is what she told me today. That's not the same person that left this house. And I reminded her that no, she's not. You have no idea what this past month has been like for her. You have no idea the psychological manipulation that she has endured for the past month. And so she may not be, the same person that left, and there may be, substances. And so just trying to give her just a bit of education. Yes, I'm asking, I just don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to move to fix it mode, but this caregiver seems very stressed, and it's kind of, she's making these very strict boundaries. If this her 13-year-old doesn't do X, Y, Z, then I'm going to have a meeting with the Department of Children and Families, which is DCF for us here, pretty much to say that she's going to have the adoption overturned. And I'm trying to, kind of walk a fine line between supporting her and then also advocating for her daughter, because it's like, she's already been adopted, she's already had a failed adoption. If you turn your back on her now, it just is going to reinforce, what she's feeling about herself and what society has, you know, kind of told her already. So I'm really trying to work to support this mom, because we don't have a support group off of the ground yet. But then also trying to walk that fine line of still advocating for her daughter. And for me, this is where a lot of my parents are. I could say maybe one or two that are really in the space where they're like, I know this is going to be hard, but I'm trying to stick it out. And those parents, the two that I can think of that have that mindset, have so much previous trauma that it's very hard, even as a service provider. And I often feel secondary trauma from it as well, like the things that I have to hear, and just trying to be the support for the family. But I guess I'm just wondering, like, help. How do I move forward, and how do I continue?
Sure, if you want, I can start if that's okay. So what I would recommend first, obviously, is one, just actively listening to her, because she's hurting, right? Like, and her gut wants to remove herself from the pain. So what she's doing is actually very natural. So you don't want to ever condemn her for feeling the way she's feeling, because she's not feeling anything wrong. She's hurting, she's scared, she doesn't know where to turn. And the pain is coming from, in her mind, one source, which is this 13-year-old child, if I understand correctly, right? Like, I mean, so when you think about that, you know, that's a natural thing to want to do. Now, the other side of that, what I would do though, is I would offer her emotional support, and I would try to remind her of the wonderful blessings that her child has offered her throughout her life previously. And then I would remind her that she needs to grieve the loss of that life. The life she had before is gone. There's just no way you can go back. And you have to accept that. There has to be some point of acceptance. But the relationship she can have with proper support, and I would advise counseling for her individually as well with her child, but with the proper support system, she can move forward and have an even better relationship with her child than she ever had before that. It's just going to be a little bit different, and it will be deeper, because they'll have a little bit more of a more healthy, if that makes sense, honest way to go in life that maybe they didn't have previously, if that makes sense, because now she knows what she's got, right? Like, she fought to get this child and adopt this child. Well, if you're going to fight for that kid, then you got to fight for that kid now. And specifically for me, you know, when I look at any of my children, right, like, I fought to have those kids, I'm going to fight to keep those kids. And so that was just not an option. And she needs to be able to have support to come to that conclusion on her own. You know, it's not an option to walk away, right? Like, somehow she's got to be able to have a loving support system through you guys. And if not through you guys, maybe through a counselor, to be able to bring her family back together. But you have to be very careful to do that, because what she's feeling is natural, and it's okay for her to feel that way. She's feeling a lot of pain, a lot of confusion, and probably a lot of isolation, because, you know, I mean, there's a lot of us, but there's not a lot of us connected. And that's one thing that I'm hoping this program will do, is help bring us all together, because we need to talk, we need to hug, we need to cry, we need to know we're not alone. You know, just like our kids and just like victims of crimes need to have that support system, so do families, especially men. That's something that, you know, men, I think there's shame and humiliation that's involved when your child is connected to anything to do with sex trafficking. And we really do need to remove those stigmas. And we need to, you know, not have any type of stigma attached for victims of these crimes or their families. The news is great smearing families and spreading lies or twisting things, you know, dating or not dating, and making it sound like it's this big scandalous thing versus what it is. And I think as a society, we really have to strip all those stigmas away and realize these are victims of crimes. The same as if somebody walked into a 7-Eleven and got shot, right? Like it is a crime, regardless of the circumstances involved in the crime. And I think we need to rip all those stigmas away and remember that this is somebody's mother's child, somebody's brother or sister, and we need to embrace them and love them and support them.
Marie, thank you for sharing. To echo Emma, there were two things that came to my mind when this first happened, and she came to stay with me in the initial aftermath, because I didn't have a support group, and the question was just asked to me, how would that have helped? Well, sort of to your mom, to the mom that you're dealing with, you feel this enormous responsibility. You feel this guilt. How did I not prevent this? How did they not know that they were so loved, that this shouldn't have happened? Like there's some personal responsibility we take on ourselves as parents and even grandparents. But there were two words that came to me in the midst of me trying to find some place to go. And that was that I needed to bind up her wounds. And I knew that there was a lot of wounds, not just outward wounds, but the heart wounds. And I need that was the first thing that came to me. And the other part, which seems fairly simplistic, but like Emma said, these are not the same children that come back to us. We have to unconditionally love them. They may not look different, act different, think differently, but that unconditional love has to be there. And so I think support groups, and maybe Emma can speak to this too, since that's what we're talking about, would help us be equipped to know how to do that and how that looks going forward. So I hope that you can encourage this mom to hang in there, because this could be the make it break it for this little 13-year-old who needs to know that she still can be loved no matter what.
Yeah, I'm
If I
sorry.
can say something. This is Graciela Marquina. Marie, I wanted to add something for you as an advocate, because you were, of course you're listening things, and that's definitely very, very hard as an advocate. What I usually do is I have a wonderful colleague who is always available for me to debrief the situation and talk about it. And of course, what all the advocates always say to each other, drink water, have time for yourself, do something all that. I do believe that debriefing is one of the things that it had been great for me to talk, and I kind of like, we need, as an advocate, we also need to realize that there is acceptance about the situation and about what the mother or the survivor is deciding to do. And that is really hard. But the respecting their choices, and then keep listening and supporting them, and giving them information is great. For you, debriefing, I just send you a private message asking you what organizations you work for, and if you text, if you get together, I would love to connect with you. I am in Tallahassee, so yeah, let's do networking. Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
I do believe we have some other questions in the chat, if you guys are ready for others.
Sure.
I think one of the first ones that came in was, did you ever experience stigma, either self-stigma or discrimination from friends, neighbors, even healthcare workers, based on the event that your family went through?
you want me to go first, or it's okay? I think you suffer from a lot of personal stigma. First off, I think there's shame that is put on yourself, and fear of talking about the circumstances with other people. I think it also depends on the layers of what happens. So if maybe there's court orders to keep the person away from the family and things like that, that could also cause additional problems. And so I think there's a lot of personal that you put on yourself, but then there is from other people. I personally know of a time where someone made a comment that, relating to prostitution, and it could not have been more hurtful, right? Like as if all of a sudden they were taking the crime aspect out of it and making it sound like this was an act specifically as wanted, right? And that kind of like re-injures the family. Also, one of the things we dealt with a lot is specifically, people would say things to the effect of like, everything happens for a reason. And I think that can be like stabbing someone with a sword, right? Because what part of sex trafficking crime would you say happened for a reason, right? Like somebody was sexually assaulted or, kidnapped, or like, so is my child specifically in that circumstances, would you say that my child was not worthy of the love of God because this had to happen to them? And so I would say be very careful whenever you're talking to a victim or family of a crime, and be cautious of the wording that you choose, because things like that can scar a family deeper than you can intensely imagine and cause even more pain and suffering, to the point that you will then separate yourself from being around other people, because that is your fear, is that people then will associate, well, this had to happen, right? And your child had to be the one to suffer in order for this, outcome and other things. It is just so painful. And I think it's just really important that we are very cautious on what we say to other people at all times. But I also think, like I said, there's that stigma. When you think sex trafficking and things like that, everyone just associates prostitution with it. And in the sense that a choice factor was made. And then, the other aspect is, if your child is 18 versus 17, the day before their 18th birthday, people then associate that child as an adult, regardless if they're 100% under the care of their parent and receiving full financial coverage from mom and dad, or, still in high school, or whatever the circumstances. Society says that this person is an adult versus a child any longer. So then it's like a whole different way that people look upon that family versus one that has a, say, 6-year-old child. And so I think that we really just need to remember that regardless of the age of a sex trafficking victim, that they still feel pain. Their family still feels pain. It doesn't matter if they're 35 or 6. The pain that they go through is still there.
I do know that in the case of my granddaughter who was missing for 8 or 9 days, there was an Amber Alert that went out. And in their local city, her face was splashed all over the news. And people from my daughter's background and friends that hadn't been in touch for years are all of a sudden blowing her phone up and going, oh my goodness, what has happened? And then when she was left in the neighborhood and walked home, there were always these follow-up questions of which just made my daughter and her family want to retreat even further away, because they didn't know how to answer these questions. And even within the family, it took a long time, many, many months, to even discuss what had happened. And so there's definitely a stigma that you feel. My daughter and her husband ended up moving to another state. I'm not sure that would be called the exact reason they did that, but the neighborhood had seen the police come to their home every single day to give updates on what they knew and what they didn't know. And so you definitely felt like you were in the spotlight, or they definitely felt like they were in the spotlight. And it was what in the world, instead of, you didn't feel that coming alongside of compassion and or with the thought that somebody was walking through this with you. And I think that goes back to the support groups. You need to know that people are walking through it with you.
Thank you both for your answers. I think we have a couple more questions, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, okay. Thank you for sharing this is from G. Marquino. Thank you for sharing your accounts. In terms of prevention, what would you say to grandmothers and mothers to help?
Sure. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier on that I think prevention has to start in two places. One, as a society, we need to talk about it more in our homes. I think parents need to be more aware of what their children are doing. We think we know, but you don't always know everything. And I really hate to say you have to be a detective, but you have to be a detective, right? Because people are sneaky, and I'm not just talking about our children, I'm talking other people as well. So we really have to know everything that's going on, as much as we don't want to be the helicopter parent. Unfortunately, sometimes, you kind of have to. I also think that, in the school system, I think that there has to be prevention programs. I think they should be required as part of the curriculum. I don't think they should be an optional. And I think they should talk about a variety of issues, sex trafficking, but I also think sexual assault in general. I also think that we need to include men. That's something that we don't really talk about. People think that it just happens to females, and it doesn't. And, less men are willing to come forward and talk about a sexual assault or talk about sex trafficking and things like that because of the stigma associated with that. They're automatically assumed to be homosexual if it's been a relationship with another man, and things like that. And I think we've got to remove those stigmas and remember that they suffer just as equally and just as hard as a female would. And we really need to include that. We also need to think about domestic violence as part of that, right? So when you do prevention programs, it needs to be included, all of these different parts in it. But we also have to have a component with our parents, because, a lot of parents don't see these things coming. We think we know it, we think we would see it, and we don't. And so it's really, really important. Or maybe there are warning signs and things, but hindsight 2020 happens after the fact, right? So it's really important to teach parents, what to watch for, what to do when you notice something, how to do it so that you don't scar your relationship, with your child, or as minimal as possible, obviously. And then where to go from there if you do suspect it. I'd love to say go to your local police department, but the reality is sometimes that's really hard to do unless you 100% know, right, that something is happening. So it's nice if we could get more support where people could feel that they could say, hey, look, this is what's going on. And I noticed my kids buying all this really nice stuff, but they're acting really weird too. I don't know what's happening. And then you could kind of have someone to lean on for advice or support in that way.
Definitely agree with educating the teenagers about this, because after my granddaughter, when she was with me, she did not see herself as being a trafficked victim because she wasn't kidnapped. She thought that that was the only way you really are a victim of trafficking, is if you're kidnapped and taken away. Now, she went with her friend willingly, so she didn't even conceive that this is what was happening to her. And so definitely, you know, it needs to be in the schools. And I've often thought, you know, like when my kids were growing up, you know, you had the drug awareness programs, which were in the schools. Well, I didn't know anything about what was being taught in the schools. So I think parents have to be hands-on with knowing what's out there and how they lure teenagers into these kinds of situations, whether they let them come in and out or they actually do take them and sell them. I think parents need to know. So.
And each of you guys actually have a voice. So you could actually contact your local delegate and you can notify them of how you feel in your heart, the importance of having a sex trafficking prevention program in school systems or in your community. The more people that fight for them, then they will have them. But if you have one parent or two parents all by themselves, less people are willing to listen because all we have is a story or a moment. But when you have 500 individuals, regardless if they've lived through that circumstance or not, reach out to their personal delegate, all of a sudden, even if you don't have the same delegate, they're all going to start talking. So I really encourage each of you to reach out to your delegate and request that they move forward with having a prevention program in their high schools and in their middle schools to start. And then we can go from there on building more of a program in the community similar to the one here, obviously, if not the one here, that helps with support system with families.
I think we have another question from Victor. Let me make sure I didn't skip over anybody's. All right, and he asks, have you found that the language we use when developing prevention initiatives for human trafficking is always helpful when often it does include sex work and prostitution? You know, I'll let you guys go ahead, but I do have a piece to add to that after, just from a previous interview that I had done.
Okay, so is he specifically asking like the type of wordage being combining prostitution and sex work into human trafficking? Is that what he's asking? Sorry.
I'm seeing a nod.
Yes, okay. So I think often when you add those in, the world all of a sudden condemns the victims, right? Or condemns the crime itself. So think of like, if you have we'll just say a 16-year-old girl kidnapped off the corner of the street. Sex trafficking is not involved. She's sexually assaulted by a male that kidnaps her and releases her. Sympathy from the community everywhere, okay? But then change it, 16-year-old girl, kidnapped off the corner, taken into sex trafficking, right? All of a sudden, the word sex trafficking is there and the world goes, oh, and nobody helps the family or helps the girl. And that's the difference. We really need to remove the stigma from sex trafficking. The two cases are exactly the same. Two victims of a crime, right, were involved, and yet the world treats both victims very different.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about my own granddaughter not thinking that she was trafficked and not even knowing that she was trafficked. So you're right, Emma, there has to be definitely clarification on what is actually going on here so that people, like you say, people don't just go, oh, I don't want to talk about that, or that happens in other parts of the world.
Right. And then I'm sorry. And the other part of that too is, you know, when you live through a moment like this, the world shuts your family away. right? Because they don't know how to deal with you. They don't know how to deal with the victim. They don't know how to deal with the individual parts, meaning the family itself. And so when you're dealing with secondary trauma, which we kind of covered earlier, you know, the world kind of goes, what in the world is happening? You should just be grateful, right? But they really don't want to deal with the trauma aspect of these type of crimes. So think of it like, you know, People magazine taking a picture, victim comes home, that's the end to them. But the reality is, years down the road, you're still falling apart. The victim might be still falling apart. And so we really need to remember that these crimes are not a show up your home and everything's okay. There's like multi layers of care. And so as a community, when these things happen, we need to pull together for the victims, including the family, and pull together and offer support. Medical professionals, same thing. You know, one of the best things that ever happened, specifically for me, was knowing that a doctor once said, "How are you?" And that was the best thing that happened, because until that point, I didn't think how I was. I didn't think about myself, right? And all of a sudden, I was like, I'm falling apart. That was the reality, as I was falling apart, but nobody had asked me what I was feeling, not outside of my home anyway. And at that moment, the reality set in. And if medical professionals turn to the family and say, even in the ER, right, say, how are you? You could save months or years of additional trauma. You really could, because at that moment, it's like a light switch effect where it's like, oh, I'm not okay. Like, I don't know what's happening right now. And so that's another thing I encourage you to do, is really, really think about asking those questions to other people that are there. Sometimes it might just be a really close best friend that's falling apart because they're there for that particular person.
I'd love to ask sorry, Julie, I think you were about to say
Oh,
something.
no, just, I was gonna talk a little bit about a question that I had from one of the interviews. I was speaking with the Department of Justice because, just to be frank about this, the biggest question that even I get asked as somebody who has not been in this line of work for an extensive period is, you know, what is the difference between prostitution and human trafficking? And you can Google it, you can look anywhere, and just flat out honest, a lot of people don't have a clear definition of that yet. Even when you ask people in the Department of Justice, they really, some people even leave that open for interpretation, and they have different meanings of what the two are. So that is still something, like, language is very important when we talk about these things, because that distinction is still something that is very difficult for people to decipher and to talk about. I know personally that is a very difficult question for me to answer sometimes when I get asked. So I would try to, you know, equip myself and do research and look into it. And there's never any clear definition. Some people have better explanations than others, but that is a very difficult topic to go into.
Well, under the law, it is clear that a minor cannot consent to sex. So
Right.
there's, you know, no question about that. The problem, I think that, and we have been talking about that. I think I know you already. Some of you, Ben and David, because I have been joining some of your trainings this week. Is that if somebody is working as a you know, in sex work, that person makes themselves vulnerable to follow into human trafficking. But basically, what I, in our trainings, what we say is, and what we believe is that as long as you have agency, then that is something else as being working against your will, because, you know, the same things, somebody's threatening you or forcing you or coercing you. So that's the difference. it does help to go back to the legal definition, I think. So hopefully, Victor, that will help a little bit. I don't know. Thank you.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's the one thing that we don't think about. So someone can, right, go into prostitution and make a choice to sell themselves for money. But at some point, they can also have that stripped away from them, that choice. But often people that get into any type of sex industry often have a background history of sexual assault. So personally, I think it really depends on the circumstances involved, because if you have someone, let's just say 17 years old or 19 years, I'll say 19, so they're an adult now, 19 years old, who's been previously sexually assaulted, acting out, doing things like that, go into prostitution as a form of making money. We'll even just say so they can buy food, okay? And then they meet someone who then puts them in a direction of what we would classify more sex trafficking area. You know, to me, they were a victim the first time they were sexually assaulted. So their mind is changed. They don't think like someone who's not sexually assaulted. So you might go, well, I haven't been sexually assaulted. I don't understand why they'd go into prostitution. But then if you have someone who has been sexually assaulted and had all of that taken away from them, right? Their innocence removed from them and had it stripped away, you might feel very different about the act of prostitution, because sex is no longer an act of love. Sex is something that is freely taken, right? And I say freely, I don't mean freely in the sense that, it's taken, but it is, right? And so it's one of those things that when you've been victimized previously, something like prostitution doesn't really, that's like going and flipping burgers at McDonald's, and you can't understand that unless you're in that same mindset. And so sometimes when people start off in one direction, we have to remember that prostitution in itself, many of them are victims of crimes way before they ever say $10 for whatever, right? And so we have to be very careful not to stereotype that as well.
I think my biggest concern and why I asked that question is because oftentimes when I see new laws being written and new prevention strategies being developed, you see this like conflation of all these things happening at the same time. And so the reaction that people have, the knee-jerk reaction that people have to sex trafficking, I think is because of that. It's because how can I react in a positive way? I think, Emma, you did a great job of saying like those two examples of somebody who's kidnapped and sexually assaulted versus somebody who's experiencing sex trafficking, with this conflation and this description all the time of all these things kind of being combined. It's really hard to know like what are we reacting to and how do we react appropriately, because as you're saying, like sex trafficking is such a horrendous and traumatic experience, and almost has to have a very definitive definition that I don't really see us having right now to provide agency and provide effective resources to, in order to not have it downplayed or having to face the same stigmas that some other populations and some other issues are facing.
Well, and I think the more awareness we bring, the more awareness we bring, then obviously that will help, in the long run. I think, unfortunately, it's like anything, when something happens, there'll be a case or something like that, and then it's like, whoa, and then a couple years down the road, the world all of a sudden goes away, right? Like all of a sudden sex trafficking isn't a big thing, but it is still a big thing. And so I think that's where we just have to keep moving forward. Programs like this just have to keep moving forward, because the victims won't go away. There will continue to be more victims until there's prevention programs.
My little token to you, Victor, is there is something that we learn, or we are very much into with medical students, law school students, and advocates, nurses, attorneys, is to learn a little bit about trauma-informed care. And that's the reaction that I thought that, I don't know if you, I understood your question that way, that all of us should have is not, you know, what do you do, is more what happened to you. And I think Julie kind of talked a little bit about that. But regardless, whether it's sex working, sex trafficking, or labor trafficking, the regardless is our reaction is understand that the person that is in front of us, it went through, and we don't know what it went through, and the stories are going to change, of course. Or you know, this is just a way to react. I absolutely would tell you to read a little bit about trauma-informed care. Thank you.
Yeah, trauma-informed care is a great point to be making, especially, I don't know if everybody here was listening to the very first session of the symposium, but Bella Hunake, who is a survivor, she put it perfectly in saying, you know, I'm telling you my credentials repeatedly because I find that a lot of the time people reduce me down to my experience, and that's all they see. And I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation that that's exactly what trauma-informed care is trying to counteract, is that people experience traumatic events. They are not traumatic events. So thank you for making that point. That's very true. I think, Carrie, are we low on time? I think maybe we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. I think
we're good till 2:45.
Oh.
Yeah. If we have enough content.
I would love to ask a question. Yeah. So I think one of the things we've talked a lot about during this symposium is prevention, and how kind of getting things, like, we're behind the ball if we wait to react to trafficking once it happens. And a lot of this is, I don't know, I absolutely believe in educating our children about what it looks like when you're kind of being groomed to be trafficked, and making them aware of how to protect themselves. But I also think it's like a really sad state of affairs when we are putting the onus on our children to protect themselves from this. While I think it's necessary in the world we live in, like, it seems really unfair and cruel. And I would love to ask about your all's perspective on educating, you know, teenagers about what it looks like to be a consumer of these industries, because I think, like, an uncomfortable truth that it kind of feels like we have been like skirting around is that an industry this large, like, a large portion of our population is participating, and it's like hidden in the shadows. But like, the reality is, for an industry this big, like, we all probably know someone personally that is participating in it without us knowing. And so I feel like I have never been told, I mean, my upbringing, it was said without being said, but like, at no point in school was I told, like, you cannot really participate in these things without, I think there's an idea that you can, there's a big distinction between sex work and human trafficking. But I think if you are looking at it as a customer, it would be almost impossible to contribute to one without in some way contributing to the other. And I don't think that's like something that's generally understood by the public. And I don't hear it being talked about when we talk about prevention. So I'd love to hear your all's perspective on kind of the importance or value, if at all. I'd love to hear from your all's perspective if you think that this is something worth talking about educating teenagers about, you know, not only how do you protect yourself from being trafficked, but being really clear what it means to contribute as a customer.
Did you want me to go ahead and talk? Sorry. I think it's one of those things, though, that you have to share true stories, right? Like, you have to share somebody's life experience, like the traumas of coming home. the thousands of burn marks and cut marks that a child suffers because of what happened to that child, right? So I think it's really important, talking about like cutting and burning themselves as a way to express the pain that they're feeling. And those are conversations that have to happen in a prevention program. And I know I hear you with, it's hard putting all of that onto our kids. The reality is, if we ask parents to attend programs like this, most parents wouldn't do it until they realized it was affecting them. And that's the sad reality. So we have to start with the next population that will listen, which is the kids, right? Which is sad. Like, I hate to say that, but it's true. And so if we teach the children the good, the bad, the ugly of all of this, then hopefully we can save even just one of them. Eventually, if they go home and they say, I've learned about this, a conversation at home will happen. And it's in the news, which is good. So parents are hearing it. And a lot of parents, I think, do want to do something, but there's always that fear when you say anything with the word sex in it in a school, where parents are like, wait, they're teaching sex ed? What? And that's not the case at all, right? Like, we're trying to protect your child so that they don't feel the same pain that other parents have had to suffer through, or grandparents have had to suffer through. And so that's why I mentioned earlier, write your delegate, tell your delegate what you want, demand that there's a prevention program in the school system that will help protect your child in a way that we as parents can't always do. Like, we would all want to be the hero or the knight in shining armor and protect our kid. The reality is we can't. That's where that whole village concept comes into play. We all have to be that guiding light. Sadly, some of us are the ones who obviously have already experienced these type of traumas. So our goal now is to make sure that you and your family won't.
David, could you please ask the question again, just so I know that I'm not working around the answer?
Yeah, I said a lot. Sorry.
Okay.
I would love to hear what your all's perspective on when we do education programs, the value of educating specifically not only on how to protect yourself from being trafficked, but what it means to be a customer of these, or I don't know if customer is the appropriate word, or buyer, or someone that participates on the other end of not, because I don't know, but I would imagine that it's not like you enter this as a customer and they tell you like this person is here against their will and they're not quite 18, right? So I don't know if it's really possible to participate in any sex industry as a customer without contributing to things that are not okay, right? So I know that there's a difference between choosing to participate in sex work and being trafficked. But I think when you are someone that's consuming these things, that is like, it's hard. I don't know if it's possible to participate in one without contributing to sex trafficking. So when we talk about educating about prevention, the value of teaching people like these are not things you can responsibly participate in. And when you purchase a person for any reason, like there's no way to do that responsibly and preventing people from becoming customers, because this is such a big industry.
Right. I think, as you were saying in the first part of your question with like prevention, and it always does start with education, right? And at least what I see a lot is that people don't like the myths about human trafficking that I'm sure a lot of us are all aware because we're here in this Zoom call. We know, okay, like trafficking is something that's not just happening outside of the States. Like, this is happening here. But a lot of the general public, they're not aware of the severity and even what it looks like. And sometimes I think ignorance can be bliss, because it's a lot more palatable to think about trafficking as something that doesn't happen in my community, and this is what traffickers look like, and they're standing outside of playgrounds kidnapping people, when it could be somebody's parents, it could be someone's family members. And the first part in education, I think one of those myths is the word child prostitution, which is not a thing. There's no such thing as child prostitution. That is trafficking, because of, as we were talking about earlier, in a legal context, anybody below the age of 18 or below the age of consent, they're not willingly doing that. Even if there is a yes involved, that's not consent. So I think understanding, like teaching those pieces about language so people can keep an eye out for those things. And then I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I had another piece. I know I think it's very useful to like be telling people some of the hard truths, because one of them is just that like it's a $150 billion industry, and there's a buyer somewhere. Like that money doesn't just fall from the sky. It's like there's people that are really in this industry, and they're usually very affluent people, and it operates off of supply and demand. So again, being honest about those truths, having to really educate them that they cannot.
And
Right.
Julie, if I may cut in,
Sure.
I've had a few discussions about similar topics in some of my courses, where we actually talk about ethically sourced pornography for people that choose to partake in pornography. If you're getting anything off of the internet, you don't know that this person on this video are they being coerced? Are they being paid? Again, there's more to think about in terms of these people's backgrounds. But there are sources, like ethically sourced things like that, but we don't really talk about that in our society very much. We're not a very sex positive society. So I do appreciate David's question. I think it's a good line of discussion to go down, even though it is a little gray.
I agree. And I think that the more you start pulling that thread, the more it unravels, because it's not just sex where people are buying people. Obviously, like we all know that labor trafficking is a big part of the industry too. And I think it's important to recognize that all of us are probably implicated in some way, from the food that we buy to the products we buy, the companies we support, all of it. And I think it's important to become more and more aware of where you're putting your dollars and being a mindful consumer. But it's very hard to do all of that. And it takes a lot of time to really research. But I have thought about that, Stacey, as well, just because I think most people have consumed pornography in some way, and so we all are implicated in that sense too. And so I think the more we're able to talk about that stuff without shame, the better off everybody is.
Thank you guys for.
I would also like to add something. I'm sorry, my screen, that my internet here doesn't support video, but I think the question goes just so much further, like just more with regards to our societal values. And what I would really recommend including in these curricula is teaching about healthy masculinity. I don't know if you guys have heard about that. Those are like programs that have been addressed, and you see that usually in classes on gender-based violence and all sorts of topics of this. And that is mainly understanding the concept of masculinity, or teaching to boys what masculinity actually means, that it's not necessarily going to a strip club for your bachelor's party. I mean, that's not necessarily the cool thing you need to do. What does it mean to be a cool guy? Like, what does it mean to be a man? It starts with stupid things like boys don't cry. I mean, things we teach boys, things we teach little girls about stereotypes, I think lay basically at the source, among many others, other issues. And so I do think these curricula are rather interesting to look at and possibly incorporate, or definitely incorporate, into the prevention programs.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Simone. I love your name, by the way, but yeah, I mean, you brought up some really, really good points. I think we have to remove some of those, expectation stigmas, if that makes sense, of things like she mentioned the wedding, and strip clubs that are expected to go. And, many of the girls in there are there, because they have to, not because they necessarily want to be, on a table dancing. And I think that's something we really don't talk about. It's like, well, she's getting paid, she's good. But the reality is there's more levels to that, right? Like, so, I mean, that's a whole different area as well that we could talk on for hours, I'm sure. But, one of the things I really do want to do too is we say the word survivor a lot. And personally, I really associate a survivor with a person who walks away or survives a crime, right? So we think of breast cancer survivor. What I would love for us to start doing is remember these are warriors, survivors of these crimes that move on and heal and focus on rebuilding their life. They're no longer just a survivor, they are a warrior. So we need to treat them as such. When we look in history and we think of warriors and things like that, we put them on a pedestal. So why don't we do the same for sex trafficking victims or victims of crimes similar? These women and men are amazing human beings that deserve so much love and compassion and support. And we often just look at them as a victim because they're a survivor. And I very much would love us to change that train of thought and look at them as a warrior.
Like another aspect I would like to stress again is like what Detective Wolf pointed out earlier today, is I mean, to me, this is just unfathomable that consumption of sex trafficking, meaning buying the service from a victim, and in this case, let's make it like underage victim, so a child, which is maybe a little more obvious, is in Virginia specifically, and I'm pretty sure in many other states, just being sanctioned as a misdemeanor. I mean, that's freaking unheard of. I mean, we've got to get out there with our legislation. I mean, what is that? Like, I mean, if you drunk driving goes a little further than that, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, everything else that you beat up somebody is a different issue, but here you just get a fine. I mean, because you get caught. So I'm from Germany, and prostitution is legal there, but we have still huge issues with sex trafficking, I have to say. So 400,000 registered prostitutes, and at the same time, still huge issues with sex trafficking, both foreign victims and of course also child victims. So that tells you that is not going to help, even if we legalize it. Talking about, the distinction between customers consuming prostitution and customers being then buying, so to say, sex trafficking, there is underlying issues are issues most likely of power. That is different because prostitutes will consent to a lot of services in Germany. I mean, you can buy pretty much like anything, but if a client crosses the line, they will call the cops and they will insist on their money and they will be in court. So that's what I'm saying. The astounding thing there is that there is still a huge market for sex trafficking victims because customers are not just customers of prostitution, which that would lead back to healthy masculinity, but there is just some other pretty sickly thing going on beyond that has to do with power or loss of power. I can't even put my finger on it, which needs to be addressed. And I do think that addressing this with definitely also from a criminological and from the sanction standpoint is absolutely key. I mean, to make it clear, because it doesn't even seem like it's a serious issue if it's just a misdemeanor, right? So this being said, maybe another thing to get out there in policy for.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, for David, for you starting this thread, and Simone absolutely echoing what was swirling around in my head the whole time, because we don't, these people that buy these children, they are doctors, lawyers, no doctors here, I'm sure, but they're people of upstanding character, and yet they are going into these rooms and using these children for self-pleasure. And somehow or another, the society is either there. I know that parts of the music industry glorifies this kind of behavior, but we've got to go to legislation to say, no, this is not the right thing to do. This is not what you should be doing. And expose these people. Nobody's exposed. And it's like Simone said, they're not even, it's hardly a hand slap. You know, we rail against the pimps, which is the right thing to do. They should be incarcerated. But what about the people that are buying? Yeah, there's a lot.
There would be no pimps if there wasn't a market, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
That's
the market
exactly
would
right.
make it possible.
Well, and the reality is a lot of people don't realize how little time people get. So, I mean, you can sodomize someone, you can specifically kidnap someone, you can torture, try to kill someone and get 3 to 4 years. And that is the reality that we don't talk about. You can molest a child and walk away with 6 months, and that's it. And so, Simone, you brought up great points. David, I agree, this is awesome because we really do have to change the harshness of our legal system or lack of, right? We have to hold more people accountable for what they do to our children. I think it's ridiculous that you can get 1 year for kidnapping. 1 year, that's it. And that should absolutely horrify us because these people are back on the streets. And most of the time they do it all over again.
Just a little thing that I'm thinking, we haven't even started talking about the opioids problem that we have. And one thing that we have seen around this area is, unfortunately, parents that are that have addictions have sold their kids. One of the parents that, or mother that, I think it was the case came last year, don't remember, she had selling her own child for 10 years. And that's horrible. Is a really multi-problem with opioids and what you said, the buyers and other things. But of course, we don't have time for that, but that's, I think, is a good topic. Thank you.
I think we're about 5 minutes out. So, just to
I would like to say one more thing regarding legislation. As we can see, so to say, like Emma Marie was just saying or was pointing out, it is pervasive throughout our legal systems that crimes of this sort just do not get punished very harshly. And I think that kind of stands for or shows us what the value system in the society is, and with that within legislative chambers, because we have seen that recently now enough that legislators represent their constituents. So apparently it hasn't been understood throughout society, meaning from all of us, not us, but from this from voters. They don't really understand how this looks. So that's an educational thing. And most likely it hasn't been brought to the top of the agenda how much a human life is worth or human well-being is worth. And in this case, integrity, health and integrity and well-being is worth. And most of the time, since victims of the type of that we were talking about right now are women and girls still, and of course a lot of LGBTQ kids as well, it still shows, or it's like, I would say is a symbol for or symbolic for a devaluation of women. It just comes back to this, to the topic, the Me Too movement, all these things that just came up recently. It's like, it's not on top of the legislative agenda to bring these crimes to higher sanctions. So, most of the legislators are still men, and that has been in history an issue. The age of consent took forever to get raised up from age like 8, 9, 10 in Florida to then age 16 and whatever. So, that's been a while, but you know, the fact how divorce, how rape in marriages took until the 80s or something to be actually made a crime. I mean, we have to look back at that history. Maybe it's helpful, and just become more aware of what society's values are and where we should be working. And any one of us can work around us with friends and wherever we are, to just raise more awareness. I mean, it goes back to education, all of these issues, right? We don't know, legislators don't know, and then we just have to be out there and I guess stand up for it.
Thank you for that last point, Simone. This has been amazing discussion. Thank you guys so much for engaging with everybody, for your thoughtful and like candid answers. Just one last thing to add, if I may, that I know I didn't realize there were so many people here from all along the East Coast, it seems, and even out of the United States that are in this field of work. So if you'd like to connect after, I am available on LinkedIn if you would like to talk any more about this or just collaborate on some things. So please feel free to shoot me a message.
Yes, and I want to thank you, Julie, Emma, and Celie. Thank you so much. For all of you out there who would like to continue the brainstorm on the support group, we would love your feedback. We have not piloted yet, but if you feel like you want to pilot in your area, let's brainstorm. And thank you so much for all of the great feedback. And Julie, Emma, Celie, thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.
And I'll turn it over to you for survey and
LinkedIn, or sorry, not LinkedIn, link for the Zoom for our next session.
Yes, thank you. So the next session begins at 3, and we'll put the link in the chat so you can copy and paste that as the easiest way to get to our next session. I'll share my screen with the link and the QR code to the feedback form. We'd really appreciate your feedback for this session and all of our sessions of the symposium. This really helps us improve and make our symposium better each year. So we really appreciate your feedback. Thank you.